Hey guys, this is Rob from ChainsawGuitarTuition.net. Last time on Theory for Idiots, we looked at what is a chord, and I explained all the notes that go into making up a chord. If you haven't seen that video, I suggest you go and see it. In that video, I said that chords can be made from scales, which kind of begs the question for this video, what is a scale? So a scale is a sequence of notes. So you can take any sequence of notes, play them up, and then down, and that's a scale. You don't have to play them in that order, but it's basically that group of notes is a scale. So if chords are made from scales, then where did the scales come from in the first place that made these chords? And if I was to pick just a random selection of notes, does that count as a scale, or is that just a random selection of notes? Now, just like with chords, we have a root note for our scale. So we can choose A for an A major scale. Except we don't call it a root note. We call it a first degree, because the notes in a scale are called degrees. So if you have 7 notes in a scale, those are 7 degrees. If you have 5 notes, those are 5 degrees of the scale. You may have heard this note being referred to as the tonic or final, but these are usually in very specific circumstances. So the technical term is the first degree. Some people would even call it a root note, but we reserve root notes for chords. Then, from this starting note, we add a series of intervals, which is basically the clever way of saying distances between notes. So this is how all scales work. We start with the first degree, and then we add other notes at various distances away from that first note. So 2 frets, that can be our second note, then 3 frets, 3 fret distance, then 5 frets, and so we have as the first few notes of our scale. Now, you can have as many notes as you want in a scale. In the very first scales, in prehistoric times, they would have had 1 note, maybe 2 in their scales. And nowadays we have extreme jazz with octatonic scales that have 8 notes per octave. The most common scales we use now include the 7-note major scale or the 5-note pentatonic scale. So, as I said, the scale starts off with the first degree, and this was fine for most of prehistory. Maybe there was 1 or 2 degrees, first degree, second degree. And then, independently, in several different places in the world, they came up with the 5-degree scale, we know as the pentatonic scale. And this was all before music theory was invented. So nobody was writing this down. So this is a good example of how music theory describes what's happening. It doesn't tell you what to do. That bit's important. Anyway, by medieval times, they'd come up with the 7-note heptatonic scales. There were 4 of them, which they used in 2 different contexts, so they counted as 8. But there were 4 modes. I think it was Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian. The rest hadn't been invented yet. They had 7 notes, and the 8th note was called octavus, which is Latin. But they only spanned 1 octave. So you'd have Dorian, for example, and that'd be it. Then, in a great example of how music theory can actually help people to come up with musical ideas, the Swiss music theorist Heinrich Galerian in 1547 invented the Ionian mode. He actually invented the other 2 modes. So now we have 6 modes. Oh, and in case you already know your modes, and you're wondering why there's only 6 modes, whereas today we have 7, it's because they didn't use the Locrian mode, because it just sounds too dissonant, and anyway, the tritone in those times was illegal. You couldn't use it in music because it was the sound of Satan. Anyway, the Ionian mode gradually developed into the major scale that we have today. And it went from being a 1-octave scale to one that repeats at this octavus note, at the octave. So you end up with, and then again, and forever. In fact, this scale is so popular now, it's what every other scale is compared to in music theory. In fact, it might even need a video all on its own about this scale. So, to answer the question, can you make up your own scale? Yes, you can. And it might even become one of the most famous scales ever. You never know. So, if you like these videos, don't forget to subscribe. I'm also doing a series on different crazy scales. So, if you like to learn about scales, then you want to check that series out. Please share this content with anyone you think would find it useful. And you can get in contact with me through the website, which is linked below, for Skype lessons or webcam lessons. So until then, I'll see you next time. So today we're going to be talking about what is a chord. So, for example, this is a C chord, as you probably all know, open C. But what is that? Is that just someone randomly put their fingers there one day and thought it sounded good, come to call it C? People just sitting around randomly putting their fingers in the guitar and going, oh, that's a new chord, I'll call it T, but it turns out, no.